Today on Inside the Issues, Andrew Cooper on gambling in cyberspace. Welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, the Balsillie School's CIGI Chair of Global Security and Professor of Political Science at Waterloo. Every week we talk to a noted expert in some area of global governance. And this week I'm joined here in the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario by Professor Andrew Cooper, a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and also a Distinguished Fellow at CIGI. So welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, David.
And
good to be
here to talk about an unusual topic, one that doesn't necessarily cross people's minds every day as an international governance issue, but of course it does have very interesting and far-reaching international global governance implications, and that's gambling in cyberspace, in part because it involves large quantities of money sloshing around in very difficult to trace ways with dubious lines of accountability. Andrew, you've just published a new book. Congratulations. It's called Gambling Offshore, Caribbean Struggles with Casino Capitalism, Caribbean Struggles over Casino Capitalism. And let's start by talking a bit about the book. Tell us about what you're trying to do in it and how it was that you came to this topic as a topic worthy of sustained attention.
Thanks, David. Good to be with you and talking about internet gambling. I guess there are two things. One, the theme that I sort of anticipated, and of course this was how small countries, how Caribbean countries could deal with sort of innovation. And of course internet gambling is fascinating in that regard because it sort of dispels the notion that the Caribbean is only about tourism and at the same time only about issues on tax havens and offshore finance. The unanticipated component was exactly about offshore finance because of course when these sort of issues about risk are dealt with, and this is why casino capitalism is interesting, because Susan Strange brought up this notion of casino capitalism back in 1985, talking about international finance becoming more risk-oriented, more sort of as a metaphor. And of course, with the financial crisis, this sort of metaphor has come out. You just go through all of the newspapers, and the finance industry is often equated with gambling, risk-taking, right, betting, and at the same time, the book shows that this isn't only about a metaphor. We're talking about a real industry, an integral industry based in the Caribbean, but also in other parts of the world that really has employment, that deals with lawyers, that really is sort of integral to a component of the sectors of society. So again, one anticipated looking at how innovation, gambling in cyberspace sort of operates, but at the same time looking at really this sort of connection and the similarities and the differences between gambling in cyberspace and offshore finance.
Now, is this industry particularly strong in the Caribbean, or is the Caribbean just an example of a place where we find this industry?
Very interesting, because a country like Antigua, a small country, Eastern Caribbean, 70,000 people, that sort of attracts both sides of cyber gambling. One, of course, really represents sort of the old group of gamblers, sort of bookies, people are sort of, again, somewhat murky, not terribly high tech. But the other side is really the fascinating, because of course it relates to global governance, it relates to innovation, people that are very sure about that they're on the cusp of something different. Again, very different from tourism, very different from sort of these old sort of static industries. So we look at sort of entrepreneurs based in places like Antigua, mostly US citizens, but sometimes outside, who come from the high-tech world that deal with sports gambling, other aspects of gambling in real time. And of course, this gives them a niche because bettors can sort of deal with NFL football and other things as the game progresses. So there's a real sort of area of innovation that becomes extremely attractive. Antigua government loves this, of course. It brings in all sorts of licenses. But as I say, it's part of the society and companies. Probably about 3,000 people are employed in this industry by the late 1990s. So again, this niche is very attractive. There's a lot of sort of high-tech component. There's talk about sort of an enclave where people can be sort of employed in the gambling industry and cyberspace, but also in other high-tech industries. And of course, there's a degree of upwardly mobile. People are sort of coming out of high school. They have high-tech, some high-tech skills, but also just being able to deal in terms of communications. There's a lot of attractions. But of course, as we can talk about, there's also stigmatization of the industry. The U.S. is not terribly pleased that the Antiguans and certainly offshore U.S. citizens are operating this type of business.
Because it takes away from American-based gambling revenues?
Whole set of sort of, I guess, opponents to this industry. When I started, I thought it would be sort of Las Vegas, these sort of traditional enclaves of gambling. And of course, it is sort of an enclave culture. Las Vegas, Atlantic City, Macau, of course, elsewhere, Sun City, off in South Africa. But as I looked more closely, I think there were two components of opposition, and perhaps a hard face to the opposition as well. Social conservatives, this idea of sort of gambling in your living room or your bedroom. I think this was sort of, and to some justification. I mean, internet gambling can be addictive. So there's sort of one side where it's just sort of against sort of social morals objection. You know, the old sort of Baptist sort of idea. With that, there's the professional sports, who of course have gambling built in, but usually in these sort of enclave cultures in Las Vegas and so on. So they don't want gambling to be sort of released beyond those sort of territories. And of course, there's echoes of the past where there was sort of gambling in college basketball and so on. And this is sort of how the Wire Act came in the United States, that sort of made it illegal to sort of transfer money and knowledge across telephones. But of course, we're dealing with a very different world when we move from telephones to cyberspace. There's also sort of a hard side, and the FBI, justice departments, and also state governments, and people like Eliot Spitzer, who of course has notoriety for, you know, and fame for other reasons, yes, but is very strong. And of course, there's a good side to this. He's also strong against Wall Street, you know, shenanigans. But there's a side where he goes after internet gambling as well. What is interesting about the industry in Antigua, and again, it relates to the differences between offshore finance, is that some of these entrepreneurs actually go back to the United States to try to fight this type of case, saying this is a legal case. This is a legal industry. This is a service, you know, in terms of people who want to bet. Better to have it through cyberspace, done, you know, even by regulation, than by doing, you know, sort of off back alleys with bookies and so on. And of course, even in Antigua, that side of the industry is taking on that sort of old, murky, you know, bookie-oriented, and there's sort of an interesting play out between those two sides of the industry.
Right. And when you talk about the case, you're referring to Antigua's case against the United States in the World Trade Organization. Yeah. What was the basis of that complaint? What was the nature of that case? Yeah,
I mean, it sort of reflects the failure of the industry based in Antigua to get redress through U.S. courts.
Redress for?
The Wire Act. The one entrepreneur called Jay Cohen goes back to New York, fights through the U.S. court that internet gambling, cyberspace gambling is legal. And rather than having that redress, he is convicted under the Wire Act and given 2 years, interestingly, in a prison outside of Las Vegas. So there's a sort of a sense of irony in this regard. But rather than sort of saying, okay, we've lost, he gets the idea, and it's sort of still a little murky also about where the idea comes from, that Antigua should take this case to the World Trade Organization. And again, it's very different from finance. You know, offshore finance is always seen as secretive. It's seen as sort of putting your heads down. You don't want, you know, even in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, you know, the Caribbean, offshore islands don't want too much publicity. Cohen loves publicity. He's on 60 Minutes before he's arrested, you know, before he's convicted, and at the same time he wants to go legal. He wants, and he convinces the Antiguan government to, you know, this country of 70,000, to take the United States saying that internet gambling is legal as a service industry because the United States has made a commitment under the GATS, you know, the commitment on services. So there's a whole segment where this small island with very limited resources sort of has commercialization of diplomacy. They can't do it all by themselves, but they bring in sort of various interesting components. There's sort of a freelance diplomat who's very interested. He's the Antiguan ambassador to the WTO, even though Antigua doesn't have the resources. They don't actually have somebody in Geneva who's an ambassador because they don't have the resources to do that.
David and Goliath.
David and Goliath, you know.
Let's talk about that further in just a moment,
Exactly.
but we'll take a short break. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. And let's continue talking a bit about this particular case. Now, this fellow was convicted under American law in the United States for violating an American law.
Yes.
So what's the possible objection that the government of Antigua might have to that?
The government of Antigua doesn't have an objection to that, but at the same time, they invoke their own sovereignty as an independent country with territorial concerns that have investors coming into their country, at least under Antiguan law, having bona fide industry and sector in the service community. So therefore, rather than sort of going and having another case within the U.S. orbit, what they do is take the case to the WTO.
And the U.S. Wire Act prohibits exactly what?
Transfer of sort of knowledge about betting, or indeed bets themselves, across state lines in the United States.
And specifically also outside the United States.
This is the interpretation, but again, it's very amorphous in terms of how the U.S. can have that sort of extraterritoriality. What is interesting, even though it's sort of jumping up the case, the Antiguans actually win the first round of the WTO case, and the sense that the U.S. has made a commitment under the services, under GATS in the WTO. And with that, it's sort of a victory for David over Goliath. But rather than going along and saying internet gambling, cyberspace gambling is legal on the basis of WTO, the U.S. goes into hyper mode in terms of stigmatization of the industry. And there comes back to your point about extraterritoriality of legalization, because what the U.S. does is basically try to have a chilly climate for almost every form of internet gambling in cyberspace around the world. They can't obviously go to Antigua and impose their own justice, even though there's worries from Antigua that they will do that they will start having the same sort of linkage that we see in the Helms-Burton case in Cuba, or in sort of sanctions against individual companies or activities in Libya and Iran and so on. But what they do is, if they're given an opportunity of an executive from an internet gambling firm who goes to say a Caribbean island that has extradition with the United States, they will try to utilize that. Or at the same time, if an executive of a company has a flight transferred to the United States, and in terms of going on to another destination, they will be arrested.
So and is again, this program of harassment and intimidation alongside a legal challenge to the WTO finding, or instead of a legal
It's
challenge?
almost instead, because what we see is sort of almost a sort of a rope-a-dope strategy by the United States. They don't want to open up the whole sort of Pandora box about gambling in the United States, because there's all sorts of complications. Each state has its own regulations. Some, like Utah, don't have any gambling. Others have all sorts of lotteries. There's sort of an amorphous amount that some of the gambling deemed legal by individual states actually has a cyber component to it. Obviously, you can bet in horse racing, across the internet. So there's these sort of exceptions. So the United States doesn't want to open up these carve-outs because it'd be awfully complicated to try to have a national form of regulation for gambling, and certainly for internet gambling. And of course, going back to Las Vegas, we see Nevada having a completely different culture and form of what's legal there as opposed to other states. So rather than trying to open it up, the United States goes on the offensive and tries to, as I've said, to create this chilly climate for Antigua, and particularly for the industry, and to sort of close the industry down, to wait them out, to in a sense make it difficult. And they make it difficult in all sorts of ways. One of the interesting things, of course, is how people can be paid for doing gambling online. At the initial stages, it's fairly simple. You just put the check in a FedEx envelope and send it to the person who's won. But of course, that becomes more difficult. The United States goes after all of these sort of conduits: FedEx, PayPal, NetTeller. Which is interesting. It was a Canadian company based in New York or in Montreal. So we see all sorts of focusing on the United States activities, but also some of the activities that seep out from the United States.
And does the United States have any allies in this fight with Antigua and other offshore internet gambling havens?
This is also one of the interesting stories, is how neither side really has too many allies. The United States has other countries that don't allow cyberspace. China, for instance, is very concerned about not only cyber gambling, but ordinary gambling, and therefore sort of has all sorts of regulations inside of China, but uses sort of Macau as sort of a gambling ghetto, and of course can turn on or turn off the number of visas for people going into Macau. But China doesn't really come into the case. The United States is really acting unilaterally on the basis of these sort of domestic pressures. But at the same time, it's also fascinating that Antigua doesn't have allies, because of course a lot of the countries are concerned about the sort of image. We don't see sort of NGOs fighting for gambling, in the way that they fight for, say, cotton producers. You see Oxfam sort of coming to the aid of small countries on cotton, but they don't, because they're sort of worried about their sort of image. And some, of course, NGOs just don't like gambling. So again, it's sort of quirky in that sense that the United States really doesn't have too many allies. But what is interesting in terms of the allies is when they're faced with this WTO defeat, the United States tries to buy off different countries in terms of having their own commitments. Because of course the United States, by having a commitment under GATT, has done the things that in a sense have obligations to other countries. And they've already made some commitments to the EU, to India, to Canada, to other countries. And therefore they start making concessions. So it shows how important internet gambling is seen, that they're willing to, in a sense, to make trade-offs for things like postal services, concessions under the GATS, for the willingness of those countries to walk away from and not join Antigua in these cases.
Well, let's talk about that when we come back. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Andrew, let's talk a bit about the politics of this versus the legal aspects of this. Now, the WTO case is a legal case. The United States is a signatory, so technically it's obliged to respect or challenge the WTO regulation. You've said that they've essentially responded in a political way rather than a legal way. Now, why is it that this is so political as an issue when it could be treated just as a technical issue? Does it have something to do, for example, with perceptions in the United States about the Caribbean, or about cyberspace, or is it really domestic politics in the United States having a foreign policy expression? What explains this particularly odd response?
Yeah, and what is so fascinating is the degree of stigmatization about internet gambling itself. again, social conservatives. Your child can sort of gamble online, you know, and ruin your prospects for the future. But at the same time, I think it's this sort of offshore stigmatization as well. And this is one of the reasons I sort of wrote the book, because in some ways, to me, the internet gambling in cyberspace is more similar to things like the Indian call centers. You know, that there's sort of a bona fide component to this, that you can sort of, again, have people moving up in terms of social mobility, learn high-tech skills, but this is not the way that the United States sees it. And as you suggest, part of it is not just the offshore component generally, but this sort of Caribbean component specifically. It's seen as sort of pirates of the Caribbean, right? This is sort of the image that you get of the Caribbean. And also, of course, the offshore finance. I mean, we've seen President Obama labeling, you know, all of these sort of brass ring companies in the Caribbean as sort of being fictitious, you know, where you have companies sort of going offshore that really don't do anything for the domestic industry. They're purely a figment of sort of the offshore for tax purposes, or to hide to money and so on.
How much of this, though, is fear that the industry itself is a breeding ground for organized crime, illicit activity?
Exactly.
Traditionally, that was a big part of the Las Vegas scene.
And this, of course, I mean, you don't get the FBI and the Department of Justice coming in specifically because of social, you know, morality issues, or to some extent because of NFL. What they are worried about is, of course, two things. One is sort of simple money laundering, and two, of course, the connections with terrorism post 9/11. So there are those sort of bona fide concerns, but certainly looking at the Caribbean, the murkiness comes from different quarters. It's more connected with the offshore financial industry. And of course, Antigua, that has this case, is the classic example. On international finance, on the financial industry, they're very much the laggard. They're not very good at regulation. And of course, what you find is this interesting character, Sir Alan Stanford, who runs this very lucrative Ponzi scheme out of Antigua. He's based in Texas as well, but really almost sort of runs Antigua in certain segments for a long period of time. He owns the local newspaper, he has a cricket ground, you know, he sort of penetrates the society. So again, there's sort of this image of Antigua that becomes worse over time, certainly as Stanford is arrested and sort of held in chains, you know, in Houston. But there's the other side, the cyber gambling. There's no sign of any form of poor regulation, a race to the bottom. I mean, Antigua, I think with some justification, always makes the case that its industry is far better regulated than, say, in Costa Rica, that's very murky and unregulated. It really is sort of the gold standard of the industry. But that is really not given much credence.
The regulation takes the form of clear reporting requirements on the part of entrepreneurs.
Yep.
Taxation, all the rules are clear, and the compliance level is high. There's good policing. Is there prosecution in Antigua?
Prosecution in cases, and even things like black boxes. You know, so in the same way as other industries, you actually have to have your phone calls, your internet activities monitored for the government. So there is a degree of sort of open regulation and an attempt to try to ratchet up, not ratchet down the degree of regulation. In one case, even though maybe sort of a strange name, the so-called whitelist that the UK has on internet gambling, that different jurisdictions have to go before UK authorities and talk about their degree of regulation. Antigua actually, not the first time, but in the second time, actually passes the whitelist sort of bar. So at least by a fairly credible country with a tradition of gambling and betting, both online and more traditional sort of bookie shops, it passes the test.
Can you bet through Antigua anonymously? Is that possible?
this is sort of, you can, but at the same time, you leave a trace, right? I mean, this is sort of one of the anomalies of internet gambling. That it's easier to pick up your sort of footprint of gambling on internet than it is by other means. I mean, and of course, that's what Antigua wants to do. They want to make this sort of a bona fide, where perhaps the names aren't sort of circulated around, but at least the patterns of activity could be traced if the United States is worried about non-payment of taxes, murky money, and so on.
In which case the United States could actually enlist Antigua as an ally.
Exactly. And this is what one of the sidebars of the case is Antigua keeps making this case, saying, you can come into Antigua, you can actually regulate this industry yourself if you want. What we want to do is innovate. In fact, if you want, you can also sort of give us some subsidies where we could sort of deal, and have spillovers from this industry into other forms, because Antigua doesn't have any other choices. Their tourism can be hit by hurricanes in the mid-90s. This is one of the triggers for the industry, is they got hit by 2 hurricanes in the same year, which devastated the tourist industry. And of course, it can't compete on things like textiles. There's an attempt to sort of move into the textile sector, but against not only China, but even on the smaller, other Caribbean countries, Dominican Republic, for instance, it can't compete. So again, this is sort of a niche industry where they sort of get hold of it. They want to. They're very resilient. And one of the other features, of course, is that they don't give up. And even when the United States goes on this campaign of sort of hyper-stigmatization, rather than sort of giving away the shop and sort of catering to these concerns about, maybe Antiguan families would be prevented from going to the United States, which again, under the Helms-Burton type of legislation you could have, what they do is hire a lobbyist in the United States and try to work within the system. Because again, getting back to the WTO case, eventually, even though it's a very convoluted case, what Antigua is given as a right for sort of winning this case is the sense that they could have a degree of intellectual property over each year. Then in a sense, they could, in a sense, be pirates, not on internet gambling, but have
legal pirates
on intellectual property. And of course, this galvanizes. If you're the movie industry, if you're recording industry, you get really worried about an offshore island that could legally, under the WTO, start importing cheap DVDs into the US.
Times.
Yep.
We'll be back one last time with Andrew Cooper. You're watching, we're listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us on cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. So let's step back from the case of Antigua and the United States particularly and talk a bit about the implications of this kind of exchange, this legal battle, the political battle, and so forth and so on. What are the challenges for global governance? Now, it's very unusual. The last thing you said, the government of Antigua welcomed the United States to come and do its own regulation. Very unusual for any country anywhere to voluntarily relinquish sovereign prerogatives and invite other countries to come regulate or investigate or perform other sovereign functions. It's interesting in part because it signals, to my mind, a sort of global mindedness on the part of Antigua. They would like somehow to buttress or bolster or strengthen a global governance regime for this particular kind of industry. They see that as in their self-interest. A couple of questions there. One, who is responsible for this kind of issue area? They went to the WTO, but it's not obvious that this really is a trade case. Who else might step up to the plate and take on this issue? And what can countries such as Canada do to play a constructive role in making sure that cyber issues are more effectively regulated?
Mm-hmm. Lots of good questions on this. And you come away sort of feeling a bit of two minds. In terms of some of the tactics of Antigua, perhaps it's not an advance of global governance. I mean, in some ways you see definitely a sort of privatization of diplomacy where you have sort of the internet gambling companies themselves and these investors paying for the the case at WTO. Antigua can't pay for this. They don't have an ambassador in Geneva, as I've said. They don't really have the resources to do this. So you're sort of having a seeping out of state authority in this regard, which I think you can be worried about because, of course, big countries could do this too. And indeed, the US, of course, has done this on a variety of cases where they've really outsourced WTO cases to private sectors. Mm-hmm. Banana case, again, in the Caribbean is a good example, but even sort of Kodak case. I mean, lots of these sort of cases where you sort of privatization. And again, I think you sort of feel a bit uneasy from a global governance perspective about private sector, sort of particularly when it's not terribly transparent about what they're doing. And certainly there's not much transparency on the Antiguan. We know that there's sort of a public-private partnership to take the case, but it's certainly not advertised about who's doing what. But it's quite clear that the lawyer the Antiguans have isn't Antiguan. He's certainly a U.S. citizen who operates out of Ireland. So you see sort of the
globalization in action.
Exactly, the sort of transnational component of this, which certainly has some good features, but it also has some concerns as well. What is good for global governance, and I think really exemplifies why this case can be sort of seen in a positive light, is Antigua, as you've suggested in your question, wants to be seen as doing the right thing. They want U.S. to come in and sort of give them a passing grade about the regulations within Antigua. And they also want to pass the WTO case. And of course, this is one of the few cases that a small country has had that sort of resilience. Usually the big cases in the WTO are sort of US, EU, Brazil, China, and so on. To have a country of 70,000 not only take on this case, but take it on over about 5 years, from 2003 up to 2007, 2008, with even some spillover after that, is sort of something that we can see innovation. And the fact that they want sort of public diplomacy to go along with this. They want sort of people to have this David and Goliath story sort of embedded in their minds, this sort of brand, that we're not sort of pirates of the Caribbean. We're a country that wants to have sort of a legal status and not be sort of harassed by the United States. So again, there's sort of there's two faces of this case that you come away with.
Right, if you wanted to represent this as a battle at the level of deep principle, you might say this is really a battle about extraterritorial application of law.
Exactly.
And now Canada has probably had more of a problem with U.S. application of law extraterritorially than any other country in the world. You've already mentioned the Helms-Burton Act. There are a number of other high-profile cases, including Bank of Nova Scotia being almost put out of business in the Bahamas back in the 90s. So Canada, I assume, sees this as a potentially important case for its interests. Have we said anything? Have we done anything
well,
that you're aware of?
This is perhaps one of the twists in the case because, as we've talked about, something like Helms-Burton hit Canadian companies, but also sort of Canadian executive families very hard. I mean, at least one mining company, Sherritt, was sort of hit not only in terms of sanctions, but also where you had the family of corporate executives not being able to travel to the United States because of their connection. Sort of not only extraterritorially, but sort of not even the direct executives beyond that into the family structure. So you would think that Canada has sort of very much, and of course this is sort of the traditional about Canadian liberal internationalism to fight that. Canada has one quirk though, and of course this is native reserves. Reserves of First Nations in Canada that can also be seen as having these sort of enclave cultures. Right. And of course, not only enclave cultures, but of course with the tradition of Oka and other things, there's not this willingness for Canada to really stir that situation up, to sort of go very high profile, because of course domestically.
So this particular topic is too hot for us.
It's too hot to handle. And of course it'd be interesting to see if this case sort of makes it more public or makes it even more sensitive, because some of the companies that are harassed under the extraterritorial principles of U.S. Legislation and activity actually start moving into these enclaves of First Nations. And of course with that, the sensitivity becomes much stronger. On one hand, they give First Nations a very strong sort of innovative component here. Again, you're having companies that do, you know, this isn't sort of bottom feeders. I mean, these are quite high-tech, sophisticated companies. But at the same time, is this what you want to base your sort of innovative drive on cyberspace, on internet gambling, where, of course, the United States has a very different view of this type of
Well, it will be very interesting to see how this evolves. We all think of cyberspace as the current version of the Old West, or at least the Wild West. And interestingly, Antigua is attempting to police it better and render it a little less wild, and the United States, interestingly, is not contributing to that effort. We'll come back to this topic, I'm sure, in the future, and best of luck with the book. I hope it's widely read. And thank you for to the audience there for joining us this week. We hope to see you again next week on Inside the Issues. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.